Center in the SPS department, and together with David Levine, I organize this series. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Yves Cassis as our first speaker to the Yves Mény annual lecture named in honor of the first director of the Robert Schuman Center. Now, the topic of the talk is Europe's financial capitals. As we all know, capital is unbound, global, boundless, but it's transacted in a very few spots. And it's these few spots that Yusuf will be talking about. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Philip, for this introduction. Yes, I'm very honored to give this second Yves Mény annual lecture. We started last year, and I think it's going to be a series which is going to continue for many years. I thought I could say a few words about, as Philip said, about Europe's financial capitals and about their development over the last 100 to 150 years. Financial capitals are the nerve centers of international finance, what I've called in my book on the topic the capitals of capital. They can be defined as the grouping together in a given urban space of a certain number of financial services. They can also be defined in a more functional way as the place where intermediaries coordinate their transactions and arrange for payments to be settled. Now, this concentration can chiefly be explained by what are usually called external economies. In other words, the cost reductions that firms can achieve thanks to the size of the location in which they are operating. And that apply to a number of industries. For financial centers, what really matters is the liquidity and efficiency of markets, the diversity and complementarity of financial services, the skills of the workforce, and access to high-quality information. Financial centers have, understandably, been decried since the financial debacle of 2008. And yet they have proved over the centuries to be a source of benefits to the cities hosting them, starting, if this is not the very first one, but one of the very first ones, starting with Florence in the 15th century, with spillover over a great number of industries. And interestingly, few countries have attempted to divest themselves from a leading financial center since 2008. On the contrary, the slow pace of reform can be explained, at least partly, by the fear that some financial institutions and markets might migrate from a more to a less regulated financial center. Now, if you look at the geography of international financial centers over the last 100 years, it clearly appears that most of them have been located in Europe. In 1914, when Europe was the world's banker, London was the undisputed financial center of the world. The bulk of world trade was financed through the medium of bills of exchange drawn on London, and its financial markets provided capital worldwide. The city was also the first truly modern financial center, offering a diversity of financial services unavailable anywhere else. Paris was, as been called by a historian, a brilliant second, with its powerful banks as its wide exports of capital. In third position, Berlin was mainly, but in no way only, concerned with domestic growth. In fourth place, New York had emerged as a financial center of major significance, although more as an entry point as an entry point into a capital importing country than as an exit point from a capital exporting country. Behind Brussels, Amsterdam, and Zurich and Geneva, the financial capitals of small but rich European countries also ranked among the world's leading centers. They offered mostly secondary markets and specialized services. These were the financial capitals of the day. There were, of course, other financial centers in Europe and in the world, but they only played a role at regional or local level. 50 years later, by the mid-20th century, when Europe required American assistance, there were more financial centers in Europe than anywhere else. New York had now established itself as the world's leading financial center, but in a period of national or imperial, for countries like Britain, withdrawal, and also a period of much reduced international capital flows. London, in second place, had not abandoned its international ambitions. Despite the constraints imposed by state intervention and regulation, the city could rely on its age-old institutions, mechanisms, and expertise. It could also rely on the sterling area, the world's largest currency bloc. It enabled the city and the pound to resume, in a more limited way, the role they had played before 1914. Switzerland, I use sometimes Switzerland, sometimes Zurich and Geneva, because they are more integrated than elsewhere, probably. Switzerland had moved to third place, thanks to its neutrality during the war, the convertibility of the Swiss franc, the only fully convertible currency apart from the US dollar, and its role as a refuge for flight capital. Paris' international influence after 1945 was a mere shadow of what it had been only 30 years earlier. And yet, it retained some of the attributes of a financial capital, mainly of an institutional type, with the expansion of French banks abroad and the presence of a number of foreign banks in the French capital. Berlin had been erased from the map of international financial centers and was still in the process of being replaced by Frankfurt. And again, these were the main centers. There was no center of any significance in emerging economies. Another 50 years later, at the turn of the 21st century, Europe was still, or again, a financial power and had its fair share of international financial centers in a financial world whose level of globalization was higher by then than in 1913. London shared the top spot with New York. London came first for international financial transaction, but was easily outpaced by New York if one adds domestic financial activities. Tokyo enjoyed a meteoric rise in the 70s and especially the 80s, challenged New York for world supremacy. But Tokyo suffered from the long depression that followed the burst of the property and stock market bubbles in 1989-1990. And by the turn of the 21st century, was no longer one of the big three global centers. Frankfurt had become Germany's financial capital, as well as the leading financial center in continental Europe. It clearly benefited from the decision in 1992 to establish the headquarters of the new European central banks on the banks of the Main. Paris somewhat struggled to properly reassert itself, having been overtaken by Frankfurt and fallen further behind the two Anglo-Saxon centers, but it still held some aces. In terms of overall size, Zurich dropped back in the international hierarchy and concentrated on certain niche, above all, private wealth management. One of the most striking differences with the globalization prior to 1914 was the presence of Asia-Pacific centers among the leading international financial centers. After Tokyo in the 1970s, Hong Kong and Singapore emerged in the 1980s, enjoyed rapid growth in the 1990s, and were challenging Europe's historical centers by the early 21st century. Now, this very brief survey of the development of international financial centers in the 20th century up to the very beginning of the 21st century raises a number of questions. I would like to address three of them in connection with Europe's financial position. The first question concerns the development of Europe's financial capitals over the long run. How to explain their rise, the persistence of some of them, but also the decline and even the fall of others. The second question concerns the relationships between international financial centers. How much cooperation and how much competition at both European and global level. But there is also the question, especially as far as Europe is concerned, of the degree of integration and centralization of financial activities. And the third question concerned the lessons of history, if there are any. What can history, what can the past tell us about Europe's international financial position and its likely development in the 21st century? Let's first look at the rise, persistence, and fall of European and world international financial center. There are both long-term and more proximate causes of the rise and decline of financial centers. The business and finance literature has identified a number of conditions that are necessary, if not sufficient, for their development. They include, the list is not exhaustive, the stability of political institutions, the strength of the currency, sufficient savings that can easily be invested abroad, powerful financial institutions, firm but not intrusive state supervision, a light tax burden, a skilled workforce, efficient means of communication, and reliable and widely accessible information. There is no doubt that all, or at least some, of these conditions can be found at some stage in the history of the major international financial centers. However, it seems to me that these conditions only provide short-term explanation. They do not convey the underlying causes of the relative success or failure of the main center. A long-term historical perspective reveals that the rise of a major center is very closely linked to the economic power of the country that hosts it. Now, this may seem an obvious thing, but it is often overlooked. In 1913, London, Paris, Berlin, and New York were the financial capitals of the world's leading economies, and the same was true of New York, London, Tokyo, Frankfurt, and Paris 100 years or about 100 years later. The ranking of the centers and that of the economies do not exactly match. This is because the emergence of a major financial center follows, with some degree of time lag, a nation's rise to being a major economic power. Britain had already overtaken the Netherlands when London replaced Amsterdam as the world financial center at the turn of the 19th century. And the United States was largely ahead of Britain when New York started challenging London in the 1920s. Similarly, it took Tokyo about 20 years to transfer the feats performed by the Japanese industry in the post-war period to the level of international finance. This time lag can be explained in terms of economic development and also simply in terms of the inertia of entrenched position. Before 1914 and until the 60s, capital exports were a prerequisite for the rise of an international financial center. In 1913, the three leading centers, London, Paris, and Berlin, were also the financial capitals of the three largest capital exporting countries. In addition, Brussels, Amsterdam, and Zurich were the financial capitals of three small countries which, taken together, exported nearly as much capital as Germany. New York seems to have been the exception, as it was the financial capital of the world's largest capital importing economy. However, even if the United States remained a net debtor until the end of the First World War, it also had the fourth largest stock of foreign investment, mainly direct investment, in 1913. Other large capital importing countries such as Russia, Austria-Hungary, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, China, India, or South Africa only produced regional financial centers whose importance stemmed from the presence of foreign banks, mainly in order to finance international trade. Another requirement was a strong currency, understood here in a generic sense and meaning not only a stable and convertible currency, as was anyway the case under the classical gold standard, but also a reserve currency. The pound, of course, but also the French franc and the German mark were the key currencies of the pre-1914 international monetary system, a status that the dollar only acquired after the First World War. Things changed with the advent of the eurodollars in the 1960s. Eurodollars are dollars held outside the United States, free of American regulation. They started to accumulate in Europe, especially in London, for a combination of political, economic, and regulatory reasons. The Cold War, which led the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries to deposit their assets in dollar in Europe rather than in the United States. There was also American overseas investments, mainly by multinationals, in addition to foreign aid. There was a growing American balance of payment deficits. And there was a so-called Regulation Q, introduced in 1933 as part of the New Deal, which limited the interest rate paid on bank deposits within the United States. And as British banks were able to offer higher rates, funds were attracted to Britain, especially those earned overseas by American multinationals. The eurodollar market came into being when these funds started being used. And this happened for the first time in 1957, following a sterling crisis, when the British government imposed a ban on the use of sterling instruments for financing third-party trade. London, remember, was the capital of trade finance, and British banks, unwilling to lose customers, began to use dollars instead. The eurodollar market grew from then on very rapidly. The eurodollar market, a short-term interbank market, quickly gave birth to the Eurobond market, a long-term capital market. Here, the idea was to use eurodollars not only for bank loans, but also for issuing dollar-denominated bonds in London rather than in New York. The first Eurobond issue took place in 1963 under the aegis of Sigmund Warburg, the scion of the famous Hamburg banking dynasty, who had immigrated to London in 1934. The London was on behalf of Autostrade Italiane, a subsidiary of the state holding IRI. And a third form of euro credit, medium term this time, lasting from 3 to 10 years, developed in the mid-60s in the form of international bank loans, fully financed by resources in eurodollars and generally granted on the basis of floating interest rates. They fueled the loans to developing countries in the 1970s, leading to the international debt crisis of 1982. The rise of the euro markets, which quickly made London their natural home, signaled the return of the City of London to the top rank amongst international financial centers. London was certainly well equipped for taking charge of these new financial activities because of the age-old experience of its bankers, their expertise in international finance, and also the diversity and complementarity of its financial institution and markets. However, the positive attitude of the British monetary authorities, in contrast to that of their European counterparts, also made a difference. What is also important is that the rebirth of the city and then its formidable rise were based on transactions in dollars and other foreign currency, Deutsche Mark and yen, much more than in pounds. Until the end of exchange control in Britain in 1979, domestic financial activities denominated in sterling were highly regulated, whereas international activities in foreign currencies on behalf of non-residents enjoyed far greater freedom. The fact that there was no longer a connection between a strong currency and also capital exports and a leading international financial center, the city prospered in the midst of recurrent sterling crisis, reflected the globalization of capital under a floating exchange rate system. This offered opportunities not only for the City of London, but also for other centers. Singapore followed this route and took off by developing the Asian dollar market, the equivalent of the euro-dollar market in Europe. The government also encouraged the emergence of a bond market. Syndicated euro credits, for their part, found a home in Hong Kong, with loans on behalf of governments and enterprises in the region's main economies, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, also Australia and New Zealand, and also, and above all, China. However, other centers continued to use their national currencies. First of all, Zurich, given the strength of the Swiss franc, but also Frankfurt, which benefited from the strength of the Deutsche Mark. Now, I would like to say just two more things in connection with the rise, persistence, and fall of international financial centers. The first point concerns their persistence and has to do, amongst other factors of explanation, with path dependency. This is particularly true of European centers. Once established, international financial centers have on the whole experienced remarkable longevity. Leave alone London or Paris, but take Frankfurt, for example, which returned to the limelight some 80 years after some 80 years of obscurity. Or Amsterdam, which regained an appropriate position in the course of the late 19th and early 20th century. Brussels admittedly lost a lot of ground, but never entirely disappeared. Now, my second point concerns the fall of international financial centers. And it's important to note that this is rarely, if ever, caused by a financial crisis, whatever its severity. The fall of a financial center is linked to the long-term decline or relative decline of an economic power. But this is a very slow process which can go on for decades, if not a century. In fact, the fall of an international financial center is usually triggered off by a military cataclysm, irrespective of the outcome, whether victory or defeat. Amsterdam's demise during the Napoleonic Wars is a classic example of such a path. But there are others. After the 1870 defeat, Paris marked time before recovering, but also it started its long-term decline after the First World War, aggravated by the 1940 defeat and German occupation. The city came out of the First World War weakened, and its decline seemed irreversible after the Second. A variation on this theme, owing to its many national dimension, was Frankfurt's eclipse following Austria's defeat by Prussia in 1866. As for Berlin and for its fall, this was a direct consequence of the German defeat of 1945. Let me now turn to my second question, the degree of competition, cooperation, and integration between financial centers. There has always been a certain amount of competition between the leading financial centers, sometimes motivated by political authorities. On the whole, competition has been stronger between financial actors within and across financial centers than between financial centers themselves. Nevertheless, there have been instances of strong rivalries between two or more centers. It has mainly been a matter of capturing certain markets, but occasionally also of establishing an overall dominant position. The best known episode, at least for historians, is probably the rivalry between London and Paris during the Second Empire between 1852 and 1870. France actually exported more capital than Britain during this period, but far more issues were floated in London. Interestingly, Paris's ambitions took the form of a proposal made by France in December 1866 to introduce a universal currency based on the franc, a year after establishing the Latin Monetary Union with Italy, Belgium, and Switzerland. But it came to nothing, as Britain and Prussia rejected the plan, and France's ambitions were ended by defeat by Prussia in 1871. With the outbreak of the First World War, the United States saw an opportunity to overtake Britain as the world's leading financial power. The emergency measures taken by Treasury Secretary William McAdoo to check the dollar crisis clearly had this objective in mind. A Washington Post headline announced already in January 1915, I quote, "The eventual shift of the world's financial center from the English capital to New York." In the late 20s, the pound weakness and the franc strength altered temporarily the balance of power between Paris and London. France's current account surplus enabled it to amass a vast amount of sterling claims and to put pressure on the Bank of England. The Banque de France was determined to use this situation to promote Paris as a financial center. For a few years, Paris recovered its glory of the Belle Époque and the hope of supplanting the city. However, it was above all a matter of financial diplomacy. Its prosperity, essentially founded on the inflow of short-term capital, remained fragile and did not survive the shock of the 30s. Long-standing rivalries were rekindled in the 1990s. In Europe, Frankfurt and Paris had been endeavoring to supplant London while also competing against each other. The creation of Paris Europlace in 1993 and Finanzplatz Deutschland in 1996, organizations each aiming to promote its center of origin, were signs of that determination. In Asia, both Hong Kong itself challenged by the rise of Shanghai, and Singapore were trying to take advantage of Japanese deflation to compete with Tokyo. In the early 21st century, following the collapse of Enron and WorldCom and the passing of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, New York became increasingly worried about the rise of London, and the mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, commissioned a $600,000 study by McKinsey to consider the matter and what to do about it. Publications of rankings of financial centers, which have become more frequent in recent years, reinforce this sense of competition. A recent influential ranking called, I quote, the Global Financial Centers Index, published since 2007 by Z Yen, first on behalf of the City of London Corporation, later on behalf of the Qatar Financial Center Authority, is based not on the size and influence of financial centers, but on their competitiveness, measured by a number of criteria. If New York came first in March 2015, ahead of London, Hong Kong, and Singapore, there were more bizarre results with this type of ranking. Frankfurt only came 19th, behind Riyadh and Vancouver, and Paris 37th, behind Tel Aviv, Calgary, and Stockholm. Another ranking, the Xinhua Dow Jones International Financial Centers Development Index, published since 2010, provide, I think, more realistic results, with Paris in 7th and Frankfurt in 8th position in 2014, behind New York, London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Shanghai in that order. Even more than competition, cooperation has taken place between financial actors in the major financial centers. And these actors originally included central banks. Before 1914, the cooperation between the Bank of England and the Banque de France was essential for the smooth running of the gold standard. Whereas the Bank of England was the conductor, to use Keynes' word, in many respects, the Banque de France maintained regulation and stability by allowing its gold to flow to Britain when the need arose, or by voluntarily making it available to the Bank of England on a temporary basis. Central bank cooperation was less successful in the 1920s, maybe, though it's not the main reason, because of the deep antipathy between Émile Moreau, the governor of the Banque de France, and Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England. And central bank cooperation failed lamentably to prevent the depression of the 1930s. And this led to its institutionalization after 1945 with the creation of the International Monetary Fund as part of the Bretton Woods agreements, while the Bank for International Settlements in Basel already acted as an informal club of central bankers. Cooperation also took the form of multinational banks being represented in several centers. While that has become the norm, even for medium-sized banks since the 1980s, it was fairly limited in earlier periods. There were 37 foreign banks in the City of London in 1913 and 18 in Paris. That was considered a high figure, far above any other centers. The reason in that, with the exception of London and to a certain extent Paris before 1914 and New York after the First World War, multinational banks then opened foreign branches in developing economies rather than in established financial centers where there was limited business opportunities. In the 1960s and 1970s, banking clubs were the main form of cooperation between European banks, partly as a reaction to the American challenge. And they brought financial centers closer to one another. There were coalitions among big commercial banks in which each preserved its independence and whose primary goal was to enable their members to offer their services in different European countries without having to be directly represented there. By the early 70s, 4 such clubs had been established: Associated Banks of Europe Corporation, known as ABECOR, Europartners, European Banks International Company, known as EBIC, and the 4th called Interalpha. They include most leading European banks, each with no more than 1 bank per country. And they were quite successful for a couple of decades, but they collapsed at the beginning of the 1980s when European banks started their own multinational expansion. Financial operations could also be simultaneously undertaken in several centers. This was typically the case with the issue of foreign loans. Before 1914, an Argentinian loan would typically be offered in London by Baring Brothers, in Paris by the Banque de Paris et des Pays-Bas, and in Berlin by the Diskontogesellschaft, who acted as joint issuing houses with Baring Brothers as the lead house. In the same way, the first Eurobond issue in 1963 was managed by a consortium led by Warburg and including Deutsche Bank, Banque de Bruxelles, and Rotterdamsche Bank. However, the issue of Eurobonds was mainly concentrated in London, and the rise of global financial centers, each in one of the main time zones, as opposed to mere international financial centers, somewhat diminished the need for pre-1914 cooperation between financial centers. The relationship between Europe's financial capitals in the plural raises, I think, the question of Europe's financial capital in the singular. Is there already one? And if not, is one likely to emerge? In a seminal article published in 1974, the famous economist and economic historian Charles Kindleberger reflected on the formation of financial centers. That was the title of his article. His conclusion has become now common knowledge, but his conclusion was that in the course of the 19th century, one financial center emerged in each industrialized country, whereas 2 or more could be competing with one another earlier. The center could be the country's political capital, as with London, Paris, or Berlin, or it could be its economic epicenter, as with New York, Milan, or Zurich. This concentration was primarily due to the advantages of establishing a national system of payments. Kindleberger ended his article by wondering if the same phenomenon would happen at European level. In his view, it would, though he thought with difficulty and not before the late 80s. He was writing in the early 70s. He ventured even to name the city most likely, in his view, to emerge as the financial center of the European economic community, as it was then. And it was neither London, he saw the pound as too weak and British savings too unavailable, nor Paris. He thought that there was little likelihood of consent from the other members. So he went for Brussels, because it served, in his view, because it served as headquarters for the Commission, because it attracted foreign corporations, and because, also being a French-speaking city, it tolerated the English language. I've always had great admiration for Charles Kinderberg. He died a few years ago, age 93, and he's been a great inspiration in my career. So I didn't recall this anecdote to criticize him in any way, but I think it shows for all historians how their predictions can go wrong. So it's also a warning for the conclusion of my lecture a bit later. But I think these predictions are also important for the lessons you can draw from them. 40 years after Kinderberg's article, there still isn't a financial center of the European Union in the way that New York is the financial center of the United States or Tokyo the financial center of Japan. And this despite increasing European economic and financial integration. The reason is that there hasn't really been a need for a European level between the national level, with Europe numerous financial capitals, Frankfurt, Paris, Amsterdam, and others, and the global level, with London's ambiguous position. London is Europe's foremost financial center and the only one with a truly global reach, but it isn't really the financial capital of Europe. Or is it? Unlike New York, or for that matter Tokyo, or even Frankfurt and Berlin before it, London has always been an international rather than a domestic financial center. In 1911, The Economist could write that, I quote, "London is more concerned with the course of events in Mexico than with what happens in the Midlands." In these years, the decade or so before the First World War, foreign issues represented 2/3 of all issues floated in value, of all issues floated on the London market. They had dropped to just below half in the 1920s, but that was still twice as high as the proportion of foreign loans offered in New York at that time. At that time, that is precisely when New York overtook London to become the largest provider of capital worldwide. Paris was also primarily an international center before the First World War, but it was much more centered on Europe, including Russia, and the Middle East, whereas London investments and connections spanned the entire world. By the turn of the 20th century, by the turn of the 21st century, around 2000, London had become a truly global, you can also call it supranational, financial center, coming top in 4 of the 6 main fields of international financial business, namely cross-border bank lending, foreign currency transactions, asset management, and Eurobond issues. London held second place behind Chicago in the derivatives futures market, but first in over-the-counter transaction, and in third place behind New York and Tokyo in equity market capitalization, mainly because of the respective size of the 3 economies, but first in foreign securities trading. So that was the international dimension of London at the turn of the 21st century. But, and this is the ambiguity, London had also become very much a European financial center. In the year 2000, the city's financial activities made up 55% of Europe's wholesale financial services. That is 23 billion out of 42 billion pounds. A quantitative measurement of London's contribution to the European Union's economy was attempted at the time by the Centre for Economic and Business Research, an economic consultancy in London. So what they did, they compared the situation as it was in the year 2000 with a hypothetical model in which money center services would be spread evenly across the countries of the European Union in proportion to their respective GDP. They called it the fragmented market hypothesis, as opposed to centralized one with London concentrating them. And the results are striking. Also 15 years old, I think they still have some resonance. A dispersion of the city's wholesale financial services would have had serious effects on the city itself. From 23 billion pounds in 2000, the city output would have fallen to 7 billion pounds. That is, to only 30% of what it was. And about half of city employment would have disappeared, that is, 150,000 jobs, with the fragmented market hypothesis. But a dispersion of the city's activities would also have had serious consequences on the European economy. The study suggested that only 48% of the business lost by the city would have gone elsewhere in the European Union. Of the remainder, 52%, half would have migrated to financial centers outside the European Union, mainly New York and Switzerland, while the other half would have simply become uneconomical and disappeared. As a net result, the European Union would have been worse off with a total GDP lower by 0.17% and the loss of 110,000 jobs. And the study concluded that, I quote, London is a vital component of the whole EU economy that boosts its efficiency and competitiveness and hence its GDP and employment. That leads me to my last point. What can history tell us about the likely development of Europe's financial capital in the 21st century? One first point, actually already borne out by history, but which could have easily been anticipated 7 years ago, is that the effects of the financial debacle of 2008 on international financial centers have been very limited. There was once discussion at the time about a shift of the center of gravity of international finance eastwards, and whether Wall Street and the City of London would lose their world leadership and be upstaged by centers in Asia and the Middle East. However, these discussions ignore the fact that financial crises, as I suggested earlier, have never led to an upheaval in the hierarchy of international financial centers, whether in 1873, in 1890, in 1907, or indeed 1929. And by 1929, I include the Great Depression. As a single event, the financial debacle of 2008 was the most severe financial crisis in modern history. Never before did so many of the leading banks in so many advanced economies find themselves at almost exactly the same time requiring state intervention to save them from failing. Yet, it was not severe enough to lead to a reshaping of the international financial order, especially when compared with the several banking and financial crises of the Great Depression. Taken together over a period of 5 years and with thousands of bank failures, they were more traumatic and especially caused far greater damage to the real economy than the credit crunch and the crisis of 2007-2008. And yet, these crises, during this and following this crisis of the Great Depression, the respective position of London, New York, and Paris were hardly modified. Another point is that even before the slowdown of China's economic growth and the collapse of the Shanghai and Shenzhen's stock markets, it was doubtful that Shanghai could emerge in the short or even the medium term as the world's leading financial center. Apart from the question of currency convertibility and international openness, there was China's position in the world economy. Some historical parallels are revealing. When the United States started challenging Britain for world financial supremacy before 1914, its GDP was already 2.5 times as large, and its GDP per head 20% higher. And yet, it took 30 years, including two world wars, for the transition to be finally completed. In 1989, at the height of Japan's apparently unstoppable rise, its GDP was 40% that of the United States, and its GDP per head 80%. And the challenge soon petered out. In 2012, China's GDP, that is before a few years before the recent slowdown, China's GDP was about half that of the United States, and its GDP per head just over 1/10. Its foreign exchange reserves provided it with leverage over the United States, but primarily in matter of policy, a position reminiscent, I found, of that of France in the late 1920s. Now, to the extent that the financial capital of the world's most powerful economy eventually becomes the financial center of the world, Shanghai's turn will come, but it will take time. And it is likely to be a center more akin to New York than London, that is more firmly anchored in the domestic than in the international economy, especially with Hong Kong's role. Now, where does this leave Europe? With London, Europe hosts one of the world's top 2 financial centers, a situation that befits the world's largest economy. Moreover, with increasing financial centralization in London since the beginning of the 21st century, Europe's other financial centers have gradually lost some of their importance and influence. A position not exactly, but not entirely dissimilar to that of Boston, Chicago, or San Francisco in the United States. Frankfurt and Paris have fallen, though not dramatically in the international rankings, raising concern in the two countries. History suggests that deeper European integration should reinforce these trends. But as we know, the situation is more complex. London's position is ultimately fragile. The policy of opening up to the world bore fruits, but has left London very dependent on foreign financial institutions. It's been called financial Wimbledon, a tennis tournament taking place in Britain, but where all the main contenders are foreign. There is always the risk of some businesses retreating to other centers, and these include European banks and financial firms. Paris and Frankfurt have not given up all ambition to supplant London should the opportunity arise. A lot, of course, depends on the result of the referendum on the United Kingdom's membership of the European Union, which should take place before the end of 2017. A yes, that is to stay in the European Union, would reinforce London's position as Europe's financial center, with a gradual and complex move toward the city being properly backed by the European economy, having properly Europe as its hinterland. I say gradual and complex because of the intricacies of Europe's not only financial but also fiscal and ultimately political integration, as well as Britain's opt-out of the euro. Now, the city might survive a no. Many people believe so, although not a majority in the city itself. And there are arguments in favor of this view, not least the strength of its financial institution, the depth of its markets, and, it is often argued, the absence of heavy-handed regulation. In my view, history points to a different scenario. Since the 18th century, with the rise of Amsterdam towards financial leadership, major financial centers have always been part of a strong economic power in the form of a nation-state. There have been changes and there have been exceptions that confirm the rule. Switzerland, after the Second World War, Singapore, since the 1980s. But there are exceptions and there are also clear limits to their size and influence. London itself has in some way been an offshore financial center since the 1960s. But it was a financial capital of an admittedly medium-sized country, but still, which was the world's fourth or fifth largest economy, and that was part of the European Community and then the European Union. As a pure offshore financial center, detached from Europe, London would be bound to lose some of its importance and influence. There would then be serious consequences for Britain and the City of London, but also for Europe. No financial center in continental Europe, whether Frankfurt or Paris, could readily take on London's role for a combination of economic, political, and cultural reasons. A European Union without Britain would be weaker in many respects, including by not having, at any rate in the short to medium term, a truly global financial center. So in the end, as in the euro crisis, which we've discussed quite a lot in recent years, the question of Europe's financial capitals is ultimately a matter of political choices, which makes it more complex, but also fascinating to study. Thank you for your attention.
So, thank you very much, Yusuf. Are there any questions we have about? Yes.
I would have two questions. First question, you mentioned the fact that financial centers formed in countries with a high economic power. So my question is about the other relationship, that is, what is does the